Well, let's bring in Christian Leuprecht to the conversation now, a security expert professor at the Royal Military College as well as Queen's University. He joins us from Brussels this evening, where he is currently a visiting fellow at the Martin School of European Studies. Christian, always good to see you. Thank you for making the time.
My pleasure. Hello.
Listen, for years now, foreign policy experts have described Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a challenge to the rules-based international order. You now have the president essentially voting alongside with Russia at the UN, at the Security Council, criticizing the Ukrainian president. Is Donald Trump now a challenge to the rules-based international order?
Well, so I think if you look at this from the U.S. perspective, first, there's a sense that the adversaries are not playing by the rules. To the contrary, they're weaponizing the rules against us, in particular Russia and China. There's also long a sense among superpowers that they don't like being constrained. And international rules ultimately constrain their ability to act in ways that they believe to be in their particular best interests. And the third is that the U.S., ultimately has always been unilateralist. With Democrats, it's unilateralism with a smile. With Republicans, it's often unilateralism with a frown. But ultimately, it is unilateralism. And the rules-based international order had served the economic and political interests of the United States particularly well, especially after the Second World War. But increasingly, there's a sense that it is too constraining for the U.S. to compete in the strategic rivalry in which I think it is finding itself with China and in its ability to contain Russia.
So how would you describe this era then? Because, if the rules-based international order no longer works for the United States, we have to remember that it was the United States post-World War II that helped really form the rules-based order that Canada and other countries follow. So if that is falling by the wayside, how would you describe this era in which we now find ourselves that Donald Trump is trying to create with his decrees and his statements?
Well, so we live in an era of strategic rivalry. And the United States now has what is a near or arguably a peer competitor in China. And so this is the top priority for the United States. And I think in many ways the U.S. and in particular the Trump administration regards what's happening in the Middle East and in Ukraine as a distraction from where it needs to focus all its energy. The Trump administration also in particular, I think, sees the U.S. not just as a superpower, but is in the process of U.S. empire building. And you can get this out of sort of the way Donald Trump talks about, of course, the hemisphere, or talks about Canada as the 51st state and so forth. And empires think of themselves as having spheres of influence. And so negotiating with Putin is less, I think, about negotiating a European security order or even like the future of Ukraine than it is about where does the U.S. sphere of influence end, and where does Russia claim its sphere of influence? And that's, of course, always the way Putin has wanted to deal with the United States, because Putin sees the United States as sort of the only country in sort of the Western alliance that is sort of worthy of, from his perspective, as a superpower equal. And then the third is, of course, that what we get in Donald Trump is a school of foreign policy that is very much about Jacksonianism. It is very much about ultimately protecting American interests and what is ultimately good for the American population at home. And so it gives short shrift to everyone else's interests because of the extent to which it prioritizes the United States and domestic payoffs of foreign policy.
And we heard a bit of that in his inauguration speech, because here you had Donald Trump talking about reviving the spirit of manifest destiny. And now Canada's feeling the effect of that, with Donald Trump saying that Canada should be annexed and become the 51st state. So this is where the United States is moving towards in terms of domestic policy, in terms of international relations. Where does that leave Canada? Where does that leave other NATO countries to defend their interests up against a United States that's trying to be, I guess in kind terms, be more robust about its influence?
Look, I mean, the United States is very much, I think, if we think back to George Washington, the U.S. has never wanted to get entangled in alliances. And so the multilateralism, its membership in NATO, for instance, these are very sort of exceptional circumstances for the United States. And there have long been the view had been predominant until World War II that the U.S. is best off simply asserting its weight, its interests bilaterally with other countries. And that is ultimately the least costly and the most efficient and effective way for the United States to achieve its objectives. And we saw some of that under the first Trump administration. But there's, I think, an acceleration of that behavior because there's an accelerated urgency because the world has fundamentally changed, both as a result of Russia's behavior, but in particular as a result of an emboldened China. And I think there's a sense within Trump and the Trump entourage that if the United States is not able to contain China during his 4 years in office, that it will not be able to ultimately continue to prevail as the dominant global superpower.
So where does that leave Canada? What type of policy should this country then be pursuing up against the American objectives?
Yeah, I think, look, that's a great question. And it's related to a lot of the criticism that the Trump administration has leveled at Canada. And the way I interpret this is as follows. The Trump administration in particular, but also the Biden administration before him, Congress, have all expressed sentiments, especially over the last 18 months, of the extent to which Canada is vulnerable. It is vulnerable domestically to foreign interference, to organized crime, to financial crime, to the implantation of Chinese triads, of Asian organized crime, of cartels. And Canada is also vulnerable to extortion from China, from Russia, by hypersonic missiles, and that ultimately this leaves the United States vulnerable in terms of its own ability to make sovereign decisions without coming under threat from China and Russia. And it also leaves U.S. extended deterrence and especially extended nuclear deterrence vulnerable. And so what the Trump administration expects from Canada is to invest in making sure that Canada is not a threat vector and is not a strategic liability to the United States. And that means Canada needs to be a robust partner in continental security. Of course, the government of Canada has invested, in particular in defense to that effect, but has invested way too little and has a lot of ground to make up. And so from Trump's perspective, this is going to be really expensive. Canada is facing a $46 billion structural deficit. That's about half of the federal government spending. That there's no way for Canada to cut itself out of that. And so the Trump administration says, you're going to have to pay for that. How are you going to pay for that? You're going to have to pay for it by building pipelines and exporting hydrocarbons. And you're going to pay for that by mining aggressively, and then exporting those elements of mining that the United States believes it needs for its national security to the United States. And of course, that whole agenda is an anathema to the political agenda of the Trudeau government. And so that's why it's very difficult, I think, for the two sides to come to any sort of an agreement.
Any sort of agreement, but certainly lays the path for the debates to be had in the coming months. Listen, Christian, always appreciate the insight. Thank you for that.
It's my pleasure, Michael. Thank you.